Rose candle a year after breaking her heart, the Duke saw her again, and the room fell silent. In 1800s England, during the glittering height of the Regency era, Lady Eleanor Harcourt returned to London society after a year hidden away at her family's country estate, determined to rebuild her reputation after the Duke of Ashbury abruptly ended their courtship to pursue a politically advantageous match. Now at a royal-sanctioned winter ball held in Carlton House, where rank, duty, and reputation governed every breath, Eleanor entered the grand hall on the arm of a new suitor, a rising member of Parliament favored by the Prince Regent. When the Duke caught sight of her across the candlelit ballroom, the music faltered, whispers stilled, and even the hostess paused mid-curtsy. For the first time since he let her go, he realized the one thing his title could not command was the woman he had never stopped loving. London lay beneath a veil of winter mist, its streets glistening with recent rain as carriages rattled past shuttered shops and dimly lit taverns. Within this muted world, Lady Eleanor Harcourt arrived in the capital for the first time in a year, her gaze steady despite the nervous flutter beneath her ribs. Her return was no triumph. It was a test of resilience, an attempt to reclaim a life she once believed secure. Society had not forgotten the abrupt end of her courtship with the Duke of Ashbury, and she knew every eye would search for cracks in her composure. Yet she stepped forward with deliberate grace, determined to face whatever whispers awaited within the gilded walls of London society. Jonathan Pembroke, whose gentle manners masked a calculating awareness of political opportunity, accompanied her to the winter ball at Carlton House. His arm offered stability, yet Eleanor sensed he viewed her presence as both duty and potential alliance. She did not fault him. In London, affection often bowed before ambition. Still, his calm, measured conversation soothed her tightening breath as their carriage approached the grand entrance. Torches flickered in the frosted air, illuminating the stream of finely dressed guests ascending the steps. Eleanor straightened her gloves, reminding herself she was no ghost returning to plead for acceptance, but a woman determined to reclaim her place among those who once pitied her and who would judge her again before the night. Inside, warmth pressed against Eleanor like a sudden embrace, carrying the mingled scents of wax, cedar, and perfume. The ballroom shimmered under chandeliers heavy with crystal, scattering light in fragments across polished floors. Music drifted above the murmurs of assembled nobility, though each note felt sharpened by curiosity as guests turned to observe her entrance. Jonathan guided her forward, yet Eleanor sensed a tightening of his posture, as if he too feared the resurgence of past gossip. She lifted her chin, refusing to grant the room the satisfaction of hesitation. The Prince Regent's invited circle was merciless. They admired beauty, but devoured weakness. Eleanor intended to offer them neither weakness nor apology on this decisive winter evening before them all. Her resolve wavered only when she sensed a shift in the air, subtle yet unmistakable, like a hush descending before a storm. She did not need to search for him. Recognition struck before her eyes found his figure. The Duke of Ashbury stood near the far end of the ballroom, framed by a circle of gentlemen whose conversation had abruptly stilled. His dark attire contrasted with the glitter around him, lending a somber gravity to his presence. For a moment, Eleanor felt the echo of their past, the clandestine walks, the stolen glances, the summer promise he later abandoned. She steadied herself, refusing to let memory dictate her steps, as the night demanded poise over sentiment and strength over regret tonight. He looked older, though not in years, rather in the gravity etched across his expression, as if the cost of ambition now shadowed him. Eleanor felt no triumph in this observation, only a muted pang of something unspoken. Jonathan spoke to her, yet his words blurred beneath her awareness of the Duke's gaze fixed upon her with an intensity that unsettled even the boldest part of her heart. She refused to acknowledge him, though she sensed a silent plea within his stillness. The ballroom's chatter softened as though the room itself held his breath, waiting to see whether she would shatter or rise beneath the scrutiny of those who once doubted her worth and now watched hungrily for weakness tonight. Eleanor chose movement over paralysis, directing Jonathan toward a group of acquaintances whose polite smiles masked thinly veiled curiosity. She greeted them with practiced warmth, allowing no tremor in her voice. Each nod, each measured phrase, rebuilt the dignity shattered a year before. Yet she felt the Duke's presence behind her like a memory, refusing to fade. Her heart betrayed her with a single unsteady beat, but she steadied herself with the truth. He had relinquished his right to her affection the moment he surrendered her to political expediency. She refused to become a relic of his remorse, no matter how fiercely the silence between them burned beneath the glitter of the winter lights surrounding them tonight in full view. As the orchestra shifted to a slower melody, Jonathan offered his hand for the upcoming dance. Eleanor accepted, grateful for the structure of movement that left little room for thought. They joined the forming lines, the gleam of polished floors reflecting dancers like specters caught between grace and duty. Eleanor moved with practiced precision, though her breaths shortened when she sensed the Duke somewhere to her right, his presence threading through the air. Their eyes did not meet, yet awareness pulsed between them with unmistakable clarity. The dance ended to polite applause, and Eleanor felt the weight of the evening settle heavier upon her shoulders as whispers stirred anew among nearby guests who watched her with sharpened curiosity tonight still. Jonathan, perceptive enough to notice her unease, suggested a moment of respite near the refreshment table. Eleanor agreed, though her thoughts wandered like birds startled from their roost. She sipped cool punch, its sweetness dull against the bitterness of memory. Across the room, clusters of nobility pretended distraction, while secretly marking every shift in her expression. She realized with a tightening chest that her mere presence tonight had reignited the embers of last year's scandal. Still, she stood tall. She would not flee again to the quiet solace of the countryside. She had returned to London to reclaim her voice, her dignity, and the life she once believed unshakable within the demanding world awaiting her judgment tonight and beyond it. A sudden hush rippled through a nearby cluster of guests, drawing Eleanor's attention despite her refusal to encourage their curiosity. She turned slightly and saw the Duke speaking to the hostess, Lady Ravenscroft, his expression grave yet composed. Their exchange was brief, but its effect traveled swiftly through the room. Jonathan noticed as well, his jaw tightening with quiet concern. Eleanor felt a flicker of something perilously close to dread. She feared he might approach, not because she dreaded conversation, but because she dreaded what it might unravel within her. She had spent a year stitching the torn seams of her heart. She would not let him undo them tonight before the watching eyes surrounding them once more this evening. When the orchestra began a new piece, Eleanor sensed the evening's turning point approaching like an unwelcome tide. The Duke stepped away from Lady Ravenscroft, his gaze sweeping the room until it reached her. The air seemed to constrict, as though every candle flame strained toward stillness. Jonathan shifted closer, but Eleanor sensed he was bracing for something he did not yet understand. The Duke took one deliberate step forward. Eleanor's breath caught, though she maintained her poise. Yet before he could draw near, she turned gracefully toward a waiting pair of acquaintances, forcing the moment to dissolve. Even so, the silent promise of confrontation lingered in the air as the night gathered its tension around them once again tonight. Eleanor felt the weight of the night pressing more heavily as the scent of beeswax and winter roses mingled beneath the chandeliers. Though she moved with an elegance honed over years of instruction, her pulse betrayed her whenever the Duke's presence drifted near the edge of her awareness. She had hoped that distance within the same ballroom might dull the remnants of their past. Instead, every whispered exchange around her seemed to sharpen the memory of the man who once held her future so carelessly in his hands. Jonathan remained at her side, his courteous composure reassuring yet tinged with a faint rigidity she had not noticed before. Perhaps he, too, sensed the shift in the room's attention, the way heads tilted, the way soft voices deepened into speculation whenever she passed. During a brief lull in conversation, a footman approached with a discreet bow, offering Eleanor a folded handkerchief he claimed had been dropped in her path. She frowned, for she had lost nothing. As she accepted it, Her fingers brushed the faintest whisper of ribbon tucked beneath its edge. A ribbon she recognized instantly. Pale blue, embroidered at the corner with her initials. It had once been tied around a bundle of letters meant for the Duke. She had entrusted it to him on an evening that now felt impossibly distant, when they still imagined their futures aligned. The footman vanished before she could question him, leaving her with a soft reminder of a tenderness she had spent a year training herself to silence. Eleanor concealed the token within her glove, keeping her expression smooth. She refused to allow the Duke the satisfaction of seeing her shaken. Yet she could not deny the tremor of something dangerously close to longing beneath her ribs. This was no casual gesture. It was a deliberate offering, an unspoken apology wrapped in silk. Jonathan noticed her distraction and gently inquired after her well-being, his gaze clear with earnest concern. She assured him softly that the warmth of the room had simply overwhelmed her. He accepted her explanation with a thoughtful nod, though his eyes narrowed ever so slightly, as if sensing the shift in the air around her, one he could not yet interpret, but instinctively mistrusted. Before she could retreat into calmer thoughts, the murmurs around them intensified, weaving into a thread of fresh scandal. Two women nearby whispered with sharp excitement, their air of contained delight unmistakable. Eleanor caught fragments of their conversation, a rumor resurrected, twisted, and sharpened until it carved new wounds upon old scars. According to their hushed claims, Eleanor had once pursued the Duke relentlessly, clinging to the scraps of his affection before he heroically broke free from her supposed desperation. The cruelty of the accusation struck with a precision sharpened by envy and boredom. Eleanor inhaled slowly, refusing to grant them the satisfaction of a visible reaction, though her pulse throbbed beneath her glove. Jonathan stiffened beside her, his polite mask cracking at the edges. He murmured that society's appetite for spectacle remained as unrestrained as ever, yet his voice carried an undertone of doubt that unsettled her. She sensed with painful clarity that the whispering crowd had begun to color their perception of her, and Jonathan, despite his kindness, was not immune to the influence of watchful eyes. He excused himself briefly to greet a political acquaintance, leaving Eleanor momentarily alone among the murmuring throng. The Duke, who had been conversing across the room, turned sharply at the sound of the growing commotion. Their eyes met just for a heartbeat, and something softened in his expression, as though he recognized the wound inflicted by those whispered lies. Eleanor moved to the edge of the ballroom, seeking a moment's refuge from the rising tide of voices. She stood near a towering arrangement of winter blooms, letting their delicate fragrance mask the bitterness in her thoughts. The Duke approached then, though not with the authority or arrogance she feared he might display. Instead, he halted a respectful distance away, his gaze lowered for a fleeting second before lifting to meet hers. His voice, when he spoke, held a gravity she had never heard from him. He told her quietly that he had overheard the rumors and could not abide their falsehoods. His tone carried a steadiness, suggesting that he no longer cared who witnessed his defense of her. Eleanor listened, her face composed though her heart churned. His words were measured, laced with regret he seemed reluctant yet compelled to reveal. He admitted that his silence over the past year had allowed the story to twist beyond truth, and he took responsibility for the shadow it cast over her reputation. Eleanor replied with a controlled whisper that the agony of the past had never been in the parting alone, but in the vacuum he left, one filled swiftly by speculation and mockery. Her calm tone belied the pain beneath each carefully chosen syllable. He bowed his head slightly, acknowledging the truth of her accusation. Their exchange lasted only moments, yet it trembled with the weight of a year's worth of unspoken words. When Jonathan returned, he found Eleanor pale yet resolute, the Duke withdrawing with a final, meaningful glance. Jonathan's polite inquiry concerning her expression betrayed a flicker of unease. She assured him she was well, though she sensed that the balance of trust between them had subtly shifted. He guided her back toward the center of the room, but his earlier warmth felt more cautious, as though he were already calculating the cost of continued association with her. The night pressed onward. drawing more guests into its glittering orbit. Eleanor danced twice more, though each step felt heavy beneath the awareness that the scandal continued to ripple through the ballroom. Whispers followed her movements, their tone now sharpened by the Duke's brief proximity. Jonathan's once eager attentions seemed tempered by a quiet reassessment that made Eleanor's stomach twist. Yet she maintained her poise, determined to weather the evening with dignity. A renewed hush swept across the ballroom when a heated exchange broke out near the orchestra. One of the Duke's political allies had made a sly insinuation regarding Eleanor's supposed persistence. The Duke responded with controlled severity, his voice carrying just enough to reach attentive ears. He declared that Eleanor had never once sought to entangle him, that the fault of their severed courtship rested solely upon his shoulders. His words possessed a rare honesty, unshielded by the usual formality of noble decorum. Conversations halted, fans stilled, and eyes widened. His public defense of her reputation violated the quiet code of political self-preservation. Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly as guests registered the significance of his statement. Jonathan's face hardened with a complex blend of surprise, wounded pride, and tentative understanding. He excused himself again, claiming the need to steady his thoughts, though Eleanor suspected he sought counsel or distance. The Duke did not look toward her after speaking. He simply resumed his place with an air of resigned inevitability, as though he had finally accepted the consequences of choosing integrity over ambition. The evening slowed into a tense calm, its earlier sparkle dimmed by the shock of the Duke's bold declaration. Eleanor remained near the edge of the gathering, her breath slow and measured. Though his intervention exposed her to renewed scrutiny, it also restored a piece of truth she had believed lost forever. She allowed herself one small exhale of relief, though she did not permit hope to intrude. She had learned, through painful lessons, that hope without caution was simply another form of surrender. As the orchestra began its final selections, Eleanor watched the Duke step toward one of the side doors, his expression unreadable. Jonathan returned, quieter now, his demeanor thoughtful rather than wounded. He offered her his arm once more, and she accepted, though she sensed his hesitation remained unresolved. The night had not repaired the fractures in her life, but it had illuminated them. The Duke's gesture, unexpected and costly, had shifted something intangible, and though she resisted its pull, she could not deny the tremor it left within her. The ball drew toward its close, yet the reverberations of the evening lingered thick in the air. Eleanor knew the night marked a turning, subtle yet undeniable, in the fragile balance between reputation, affection, and truth. And as she stepped toward the entrance hall with Jonathan at her side, she sensed the story of this winter return had only begun to unfold. Snow fell in delicate spirals outside the lantern-lit windows of the Montfort residence, where the second gathering of the season had drawn London's elite into another night of polite rivalry. Eleanor stepped from her carriage with a composed breath, though the air stung with the cold clarity of unwelcome expectation. She knew whispers from Carlton House had reached every drawing room by morning. The Duke's public defense of her had rippled through the city like a pebble cast into still water, disturbing alliances, stirring hope in hearts that had no right to hope, and unsettling Jonathan in ways he had not yet found words to express. Tonight, she intended to move with steady dignity, neither indulging the scandal nor offering the Duke's gesture more meaning than it deserved. Yet beneath her resolve lay a fragile uncertainty she could not entirely quiet. Inside, the Montfort ballroom glowed with candlelight that shimmered across gilded molding and mirrored walls. Conversation flowed in gentle waves, though each wave seemed to break against Eleanor the moment she entered. Jonathan walked beside her, his posture attentive, but absent of the ease he once held. His silence weighed heavier than any accusation. She could not blame him. He was a man building a future upon reputation, connection, and strategic alliances. The Duke's defense of her had complicated the narrative the world believed, but it had not erased the discomfort of his own doubts. Eleanor felt the distance between them widening, a quiet shift that pressed against her chest with steady pressure. A string quartet began a soft, melancholic melody that seemed to settle over the room like a fine veil. Eleanor allowed Jonathan to guide her toward a quieter alcove, where he attempted conversation with uncertain fluency. His words sounded practiced, as though he wrestled between affection and caution. She answered gently, sensing that their fragile rhythm might crumble beneath too much earnestness. Yet she could not ignore the truth that his kindness, however sincere, had begun to falter under society's scrutiny. She felt its fading warmth, like a draft slipping through a once secure window. When she excused herself to seek a breath of cooler air, she stepped onto a small, sheltered terrace draped in evergreen garlands. The night was crisp, the cold sharp enough to cut through the residue of the ballroom's perfume and murmur. Snow fell in flakes that sparkled briefly before dissolving upon the balustrade. She rested her gloved hands against a stone, letting the quiet settle around her like balm. Here, at least, she could breathe without feeling the tug of curious eyes. Her reflection blurred faintly in the terrace's frosted lantern glass, a reminder of the woman she had become. Stronger, yes, but wounded in ways only solitude understood. She sensed his presence before she heard his footsteps. The Duke stepped onto the terrace with a hesitant grace that betrayed the weight of intention. He stopped several paces away, mindful of propriety, yet close enough for the cold air to tremble between them. Eleanor did not turn immediately. She collected her breath, steadying the tumult that rose unbidden within her. When she finally faced him, she found his expression solemn, his gaze softened by something she had not seen since the early months of their courtship, unvarnished sincerity. He addressed her with quiet restraint, acknowledging that his public defense had placed her in an unwanted spotlight. His voice carried weariness, as though he had spent the last days confronting consequences he had long delayed. He admitted, with rare candor, that ambition had driven him to break their courtship, not out of indifference, but from a misguided sense of duty. He confessed that the political match he had chosen over her was dissolving under the weight of incompatible alliances and strained tempers. The future he had sacrificed her for had crumbled into dust, and he had spent the past year learning that triumph without peace amounted to hollow victory. Eleanor listened, her heart tightening at the agony threading through his words. Yet she did not allow tenderness to rush forth without question. She reminded him that his silence had cost her dearly, that while he had retreated into ambition, she had endured the full force of society's cruelty alone. He accepted her condemnation with bowed shoulders, the posture of a man who understood the depth of his error. In a voice nearly broken, he admitted that every quiet moment of the past year had been haunted by the thought of her walking alone under the shade of trees he once promised they would wander together. The confession, spoken earnestly beneath the falling snow, cracked something within her resolve. She felt the ache of their shared past rising like a tide, yet she clung to the dignity forged through suffering. She asked him what he sought now, atonement or a rekindling of what he had abandoned. His reply came with a weight that left no room for evasion. He told her he wanted the chance to stand beside her again, not as a man seeking to reclaim the past, but as one willing to rebuild the future with patience and humility. He did not ask for forgiveness. He asked only for truth between them. Before she could answer, the terrace doors opened, and Jonathan stepped into the cold with a strained expression. He had witnessed enough of their posture to understand the gravity of what passed between them. With admirable composure, he addressed Eleanor directly. He confessed that the rumors, from the cruel whispers to the Duke's bold defense, had left him uncertain of her affections. He admitted that while he respected her deeply, he sensed that her heart carried a history he could not compete with. Eleanor felt a pang of guilt, for she had not wished to cause him pain, yet his words carried a clarity she could not deny. Jonathan bowed with dignity, acknowledging that their paths were not meant to entwine further. He assured her that he bore no resentment and wished her a future unmarred by the judgments of others. His departure was quiet, but its finality resonated through the stillness. Eleanor remained on the terrace, caught between the remnants of one possibility and the fragile awakening of another. The Duke exhaled slowly, as though Jonathan's gentle withdrawal had sealed the truth he had feared naming aloud. He stepped one pace closer, still mindful of respect, and told Eleanor that he would accept whatever decision she made. If she wished him gone, he would remove himself from her life without protest. If she wished silence, he would speak no further. But if she felt even a fragment of the bond they once shared, he would devote himself to rebuilding what he had shattered. Eleanor felt the night swirl around her, the snow thickening as though nature itself paused in anticipation. She looked upon the man who had wounded her so deeply, yet also the man who had risked his political future to defend her name. She saw in him not the ambitious noble who had cast her aside, but the man who now stood stripped of pride, offering not certainty, but sincerity. Her strength had carried her through a year of isolation, but strength alone could not heal the tender parts of her spirit still tethered to memory. She told him softly that she could not promise forgiveness, nor could she grant immediate trust. But she could acknowledge the truth of her own heart, that despite every wound, the memory of him had lingered like an unfinished sentence. The Duke's breath caught, though he attempted to mask his relief. She allowed him one small, cautious smile, a gesture as fragile as thawing ice, yet warmer than anything she had offered in a year. Inside, a new dance began, its melody drifting through the open doors with delicate invitation. Eleanor turned toward the ballroom, feeling both the weight of the past and the tremor of an unclaimed future. The Duke offered his arm, not with assumption, but with reverent uncertainty. She hesitated only a moment before placing her hand upon it, accepting not a promise, but a beginning. As they stepped into the warm glow of the ballroom together, conversation stilled, fans paused, and the room fell silent once more, this time not with shock, but with dawning wonder. The silence did not wound her now. It crowned her,